Hi, everybody. Sorry for the delay. We had a little bit of technical difficulties with Zoom. We're still figuring things out. Our third panelist, Jennifer Greenfeld, is trying to join us. So if we have a little bit of tech juggling throughout the event, that's why we're just trying to get her on the stream and set up with video and audio. So I just want to say thank you so much for joining us tonight for the carbon potential of urban forested natural areas in New York City. So my name is Tessa O'Connell, and I'm the Communications and Public Outreach Manager for the Natural Areas Conservancy. We are thrilled to be hosting tonight's event as part of Climate Week NYC, and we want to give a big thank you to Con Edison. This event and many of the events we held throughout the spring and summer was made possible through their generous support of the Natural Areas Conservancy. So a big thank you to Con Edison. Now, before we really jump in, I want to just give a few rules of the road. So we are hosting this event on Zoom. We're also going to bring it over to Facebook Live in just a few minutes. So please feel free to submit your questions throughout the chat. If you're on Facebook Live, submit them through the comment section on Facebook. And we will do our best to answer your questions throughout the evening. We do have about 10 minutes set at the end of the event to tackle Q&A. So if we don't get to it before then, we'll definitely try to answer your question towards the end of the event. So that's it for me. I will be engaging with you all in the chat. I'll come back a little bit later to kind of usher in our second part of the event. But for now, I will hand it over to Sarah Charlotte Powers, the Executive Director of the Natural Areas Conservancy.
Great. Thanks so much, Tessa, for the introduction and for all of your hard work organizing this evening's event. As Tessa said, my name is Sarah Charlotte Powers, and I co-founded the Natural Areas Conservancy in 2012 and now serve as the Executive Director. The Natural Areas Conservancy works to improve the management of forests and wetlands in New York City through a combination of research, programming, and advocacy. And we work in a public-private partnership model with the Parks Department here in New York. In addition, since 2019, we have served as the convener of a national network called Forests and Cities that brings together colleagues who work in the management of natural areas from cities across the United States. And I'm honored tonight to introduce my colleague, Dr. Clara Pregetzer, who will be presenting research that has never been presented publicly before on the carbon storage and sequestration of New York City's forested natural areas, and look forward after Clara's presentation to joining in a discussion with Clara and our colleague Jennifer Greenfeld from New York City Parks about the significance of this research and its application to managing forests in New York City. And with that, I present you Clara.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. And I'd like to first make sure to thank a few people. I'd like to thank the J.M. Kaplan Fund, whose support made this project possible. And then I'd also like to thank Chloe Hanna, who was a huge part of the calculations and organizing and sort of the fundamentals of this research. So I just wanted to give you all an introduction to who you'll be hearing from, and so you can match a face to a name. I'm Clara Pregetzer. I'm the Deputy Director of Conservation Science for the Natural Areas Conservancy, and you just heard from Sarah, and we'll be having a conversation with Jennifer Greenfeld, who's Assistant Commissioner of Forestry, Horticulture, and Natural Resources. And thanks so much to Tessa O'Connell for facilitating and getting this whole event organized. So throughout this presentation, you'll hear a lot of numbers and sort of context about the work that we do. If you'd like to learn more, please visit our website, and you can also find us on social media. All right, so I'll spend the first sort of 20-30 minutes sharing the results of the project that Sarah just mentioned, and then we'll have a few minutes for a conversation with Sarah and Jennifer, and then some Q&A from any questions that are in the chat. So throughout the presentation. If you have any questions in the chat, please put them there and we'll organize them and try to address them. All right, so I'd first like to start with situating this work in the context of climate change in cities. So here we are in New York City, it's Climate Week. And we're really here to recognize the role that cities have in this global issue. And fundamentally, cities contribute to climate change in major ways. The conversion of land that was previously forest, wetland, grassland into developed houses, roads, and any sort of development can contribute to the negative effects and consequences of climate change. So just sort of the fact that we convert and change land away from natural lands contributes to climate change. But a lot of people live in cities, and so with that comes a lot of pollution, but also a lot of energy use. And cities are also very vulnerable. So a lot of cities live along water bodies and don't have a lot of green space. And so they're incredibly vulnerable to the consequences and challenges of climate change. However, at the same time, there's a lot of opportunities for cities to address the challenges related to climate change. So by definition, cities are very densely populated, so that can lead to increased efficiency. So thinking about public transportation or lower living footprints per person can all be positive solutions to addressing climate change issues. And also cities have unique governance. So cities have the ability to enact policies and innovation at a very local scale. And so we've seen this with cities adopting the standards set forth in the Paris Climate Accord. So they have a unique ability to really test things at a hyper-local scale, but also have this great relevance for local communities and millions of people. And so thinking about how do we want to live in cities? Can we live sustainably? And are there ways that we can innovate and test things at the local level that could have great relevance for international and global solutions for the challenges we face in the climate change context? Whoops. So one of the approaches to mitigating the negative effects of climate change is through nature-based solutions. So this approach is really focused on looking at natural lands, so forests, wetlands, and grasslands, and sort of how they could be managed or expanded to play a role in offsetting the emissions and the negative effects of climate change. So a few things fall into that category that I'll just provide some examples of. So land protection, so land conservation and protecting forest lands, water bodies, open lands are all part of contributing to ensuring that we don't continue to make the climate change problem worse. Planting trees. Trees remove CO2 from the atmosphere and store carbon in their trunks, leaves, roots, and soil. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But they're this incredible sort of sponge for carbon dioxide, which is a greenhouse gas. And so thinking about planting more trees, expanding forest lands is considered a nature-based solution. And also land stewardship. So thinking about how we manage the land. So these things combined have been shown to account for avoided greenhouse gas emissions of up to 21%. So there's this potential to really look at ways in which we care for the land and manage the land and how that contributes to the climate change conversation. And so we really have to be thinking about a lot of different ways and diversifying our approaches to meeting this incredible challenge. But there's also planting trees, and we'll be talking more about forests in this discussion. Planting trees and managing forests towards healthy forest systems have a lot of other co-benefits, not just storing carbon. So you think about the shade they can provide and cooling potential, stormwater interception, also habitat value, but also experiences for or opportunities for people to experience nature. So while we are focusing a lot on the carbon potential in this discussion, I don't want to lose sight that there's a lot of other important values that trees can provide. So before I dive into our approach for calculating the carbon potential, I wanted to just briefly make sure that I describe what carbon is. So carbon is an element that's found in most every living thing. So humans have carbon, we have carbon in our bodies, and plants and animals as well. And if we think about trees, about 50% of a tree is made up of carbon. And so when trees die and the wood begins to decompose, that gets emitted as carbon dioxide. And so carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. There's other greenhouse gases as well. And that's contributing to the negative effects of climate change. So when fossil fuels are burned, that is releasing CO2 into the atmosphere. Same as when you throw a log on the fire, that releases CO2 into the atmosphere. And so thinking about how carbon is stored and sequestered, which sequester just means kind of taking carbon out of the atmosphere and returning it. So like a tree will take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, use the carbon to make wood, and then release oxygen for us to breathe. And so sort of the accounting of carbon is one of the ways in which, you know, at a very simplistic scale, we've been looking at solving this issue. So kind of knowing how much carbon is in the atmosphere, how much carbon is being sequestered and stored, and how much carbon is being emitted. So those sort of accounting calculations or approaches are what we're kind of looking at when we think about how do we reduce emissions and increase carbon storage and sequestration. And at a city scale, it turns out we don't have really robust numbers for that. And so that is one of the motivations that sort of led us to this study, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, but I wanted to give this sort of diagram to describe in more detail sort of where carbon goes and how it's sort of transformed. So through the process of photosynthesis, trees will take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, store it, and then carbon is also stored in soil organic matter, as well as understory plants. And then when little microbes are decomposing that organic matter in the soil, it's respired back into the atmosphere. So that cycle is, in a simplistic way, called the carbon cycle. So in this discussion, we will be talking a lot about the forest in New York City. So I wanted to just kind of start with the blanket statement that all trees store and sequester carbon. And in the urban forest of New York City, we have trees that grow in a variety of different settings. So we have trees that grow along the street and provide shade, are really nice to look at. They can provide cooling for our homes. We have trees that grow in our backyards. We have trees that are in landscaped parks, highway medians, but forested natural areas are a type of forest in New York City, and forested natural areas are kind of what I've focused on, and they're essentially the woods. So if you're thinking about the woods in New York City or the Catskills or the Berkshires, we have those same types of forest here in New York City. So in New York City, about 5.5% of New York City's land area is a forested natural area, and a quarter of the total tree canopy. So in New York City, I think our tree canopy is about 21%. So that's a bird's eye view looking down on New York City. About a quarter of that is natural area, and the rest are accounts for trees growing in sort of other settings. But in the natural areas, we have a really high density of trees. So within those natural areas, 65% of all the trees found in New York City are found in forested natural areas. So that's about 6 million trees. And we know a lot about, our organization knows a lot about the quality and the condition of that forest. It's sort of one of the cornerstones of our work. And so we know that the forests in New York City are similar to forests that you'd see in rural parts of New York State, and they're dominated by native species and are incredibly diverse. So we knew this information about the forest in New York City, and I think that sort of led us to the motivations of this work for calculating and measuring the amount of carbon that's being stored in our natural area forests. And so we kind of had three primary goals. We were interested in calculating the amount of carbon stored in forested natural areas, both in the trees and in the soil. And this was unique because the carbon stored in the soil in New York City's natural areas had never been accounted for or calculated. And then we wanted to also measure the amount of carbon sequestered in our natural area forests, and then contrast, sort of situate that or contextualize that with another really important tree resource in New York City's street trees. And I think, you know, our motivations for this were both a little bit opportunistic. So we had this incredibly rich data set that I will describe was part of our approach. So in 2013 and 2014, our organization led the first comprehensive citywide assessment of natural areas in New York City. So we went out and measured over 40,000 trees, took soil samples, measured the plants growing in the understory, measured the amount of dead wood in our forest. And our motivation for collecting that information was really to create and inform management around natural areas. And so in 2018, we released the 25-year framework for the management of New York City. But I think we often sort of heard that all trees are important in New York City, and we agree, but there was a lot of kind of discussion about sort of the value of natural areas. And I think to sort of enter that conversation, we needed to have some numbers or sort of quantify our natural areas in a way that we could enter the sort of value conversation. And so, so we took on this project to calculate the amount of carbon stored and sequestered in our natural areas. And I think situating that allows us to begin to enter conversations about the role that nature can play in cities in nature-based solutions. And I think sort of the role that forests could play in climate change policies. All right, so now I'll transition into sharing some of the results that we found. So we found that the majority of carbon stored in New York City, so 69% of the carbon stored and over 80% of the carbon sequestered, was found in our natural area forests. And so there had been a study done before that had looked at all of New York City, so all the trees in New York City, and estimated the amount of carbon stored, and that was 1.2 teragrams. And we found that just in a quarter of the tree canopy that we found there to be 0.83 teragrams of carbon. And if you added the soil and the other pools, which I'll describe in a minute, that adds up to 1.89 teragrams of carbon. So it surpasses the estimate for what we had for just the trees in New York City. And so we also found that there's three times more carbon stored in our natural area forests than in our street trees. So just for some context, I think there's a little over 600,000 street trees in New York City, but there's over 6 million trees in New York City's natural area. So there's a lot more small, very small trees in our natural areas, but to be able to sort of situate and compare both resources, which are important in this way, was a way for us to make sure to communicate the value that natural areas have and the role that they could play in a climate change discussion. So when we look at the different pools, so that was sort of the big number. We got to that number by breaking out the amount of carbon stored in these different pools, which are basically just sort of different parts of the forest. So what we found is most of the carbon is stored in live trees and soil. So over 80% of the carbon is stored in the soil and the trees. And then you can see that there's different amounts of carbon stored in understory and the leaf litter, so the leaves on the ground and the dead trees on the ground. And this is similar to what people have found for the proportions of carbon stored in forests. And we compared our numbers with some peer-reviewed literature on some numbers for carbon storage. And we found that the forests in New York City, while there's you know, less acres of forest overall. They store on a per unit basis, so per hectare or per acre, a very similar amount as the forests stored in the Northeast. And if you can, so we have about 104 micrograms per hectare, and the average for the Northeast is 87.1. So we have actually a little bit more per area. And I think that's because we have some really big trees in New York City. So if you think about the fact that a lot of New York City's trees have not been logged for timber, the growing conditions, it's a little bit warmer in New York City than in other parts of New York State. All of those factors could contribute to the growth rates and the size of the trees that we have here. And so interestingly, we were also looking at sort of what does the quality, or like the size, the species and the size of the trees in our natural area forests, how does that factor into the amount of carbon being stored? So here in New York City, we have a lot of different types of forests. So we sit at the edge of the New England and the Mid-Atlantic ecoregion. So we have a lot of different forest types here. So we have kind of scrubland forests, and we have really mature native oak forests. But we also have a lot of invasive species and forests that are in decline. And so invasive species can arise from fragmentation, development, past land use history, and very heavily invaded sites are often dominated by vinelands and are kind of denuded of trees. So we compared this, and what you can see is our native dominated mature forests store the most carbon and over twice as much carbon as our non-native open vinelands. And this gives you an example of what that looks like. So this is actually a successional shrubland on the left, a site in Queens. And so that number there, so there's 11.2 micrograms of carbon per hectare in that site. And then if you look at this oak tulip forest site in Staten Island, you can see there's 415 micrograms of carbon. And so the condition or the variation that we see in structure and composition of the forest makes a big difference in the amount of carbon that can be stored and sequestered. And so here, this is just showing the sequestration. So those numbers were for storage, but you can actually get a net emission from a natural area. So this site on the left is a net emission because there's a lot of dead wood, and soil will respire. So as you have a lot of dead woody material and not a lot of trees, you know, your soils are decomposing, and that respiration can lead to a net emission of carbon. But then just for comparison, there's an example of a site on the right that's net sequestration. So as trees are growing, they're sequestering carbon. So we work a lot with New York City parks and sort of at this interface of science and decision making. And one of the things I think this work especially shows is how important forest management is to ensuring that we're protecting this important resource of carbon being stored in our natural areas. And so we have a lot of forests in New York City that are healthy in the overstory, but in the understory are beginning to be dominated by those non-native vines and non-native herbaceous species, which can suppress our native tree seedlings and potentially lead to a declining and degraded forest, which we now know will not store as much carbon as our healthy forests. So along with all of the other co-benefits that we have with healthy forests, making sure that we're sort of protecting this resource and the majority of carbon that exists is requires management and requires long-term management. So I hope with this presentation you've received a few takeaways. I think first and foremost that natural areas are a part of the urban forest and a really important part of the conversation when you start to think about carbon storage and sequestration. They have sort of an outsized potential to store and sequester carbon. And I think just knowing that the forests in New York City are similar to those in rural forests in a lot of ways, from native species, from biodiversity, but also in the rates in which they can store and sequester carbon, will, I think, sort of empower us to think about them and contextualize them potentially in a new way. And then hopefully you've gotten that forest management is a critical part to directing the trajectory of the forest and ensuring that we have healthy forests for the people in New York City to visit and experience, but also that it's contributing to this really incredible service of carbon storage and sequestration. So with that, I'll stop and pass it back over to Tessa to start the conversation with Sarah and Jennifer, and then eventually answer a few questions.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Clara, and welcome, Jennifer. So glad you could get on with the tech. It was a little bit of a scramble there, always keeping us on our toes on Zoom. Okay, yeah, so we're going to pivot into the kind of second half of the event. So I just want to introduce Jennifer. For the last 23 years, she has worked at NYC parks in different areas of natural resource management, from street tree planting, volunteer program development, natural areas management, and now as the Assistant Commissioner of Forestry, Horticulture, and Natural Resources. So we're so excited to have you join us tonight with Sarah, who you've met, and Clara. And so I can just jump into our first question. So let's talk a little bit more about policy and advocacy opportunities that could come from this report. So now that we have this carbon budget, how can it be used?
Great. Well, thanks, Tessa, and thanks, Clara, so much for giving us such a comprehensive, but also very, I think, accessible overview of your work. So I'm excited to talk about policy and advocacy, two topics that are very near and dear to my heart and to the work of our organization. And I'll kind of cover a couple of themes. The first is related to, from my perspective, sort of where this research kind of positions forested natural areas in New York City, but also forested natural areas in cities across the country, kind of in a national and local conversation about climate change. So the thing about forested natural areas, which Clara really highlighted, is that they are a piece of the urban forest, but people who work in urban forests sometimes think that they're more like rural forests, and then they're similar to rural forests, but they exist in cities. So the policy and legal and kind of financial landscape in which they're managed is really different than traditional rural forests. Having these calculations allows us to tap into a growing movement focused on natural climate solutions, which is the idea that the way that we manage land can be one opportunity for addressing carbon emissions. And that's something that has been looked at a lot in other settings, especially in sort of large landscape settings. There have been publications that have come out in the last couple of years that estimate that up to 30% of our emissions reduction needs in the United States can be addressed through land preservation and land management, but without real numbers about kind of the value and capacity of natural areas within the urban context to store and sequester carbon, it's been very hard beyond kind of in a high level conceptual way to really make a direct connection and to open ourselves up to things like policy support and potentially financial support from federal and large NGO sources. And then at a local level, which is really kind of the immediate landscape where we work. And Jennifer will, I think, talk about this in the next question, but the Parks Department here in New York City has decades of experience restoring and managing natural areas, but it's can be kind of a up and down cycle in terms of the level of concentrated, dedicated mayoral support for this work. And in this specific moment that we're sort of living and functioning in, the focus on climate change, as well as the focus on equity, which is these places are also really incredibly important for recreation, being able to have numbers and information that really allow city policymakers to understand the value that natural areas have in meeting local climate goals, and to be able to make a case alongside colleagues who work in other fields is a really powerful tool. It adds relevance and it adds a level of seriousness to this conversation, which I think is really important, especially as we enter an election year next year for city council and mayor, and we'll be looking to think about ways to position parks and natural spaces within New York City as a critical resource that would benefit from increased investment.
I was just going to add one thought, Sarah, thanks. I don't play an advocacy role. It's not sort of my place as a member of a mayoral agency. But what I can say that this does is that just by the thing about forests and cities is that it has the potential to touch so many people, right? So it's over 8 million people in New York City who have this potential to see a well-functioning forest, and for us to make the connection between the outsized role that natural area forests in city and even in cities play to help climate, to sort of mitigate climate change, like making that connection helps bridge those issues to the New York City public. And that is my job, to serve the public of New York City. So I love having this information, really just to be able to do my job better, which is a sort of positive feedback loop that helps people care about and sort of eventually speak up for the value of forests in cities.
I just wanted, what you said made me think of one thing. I've seen a lot of, like urgency around increasing green space in cities, or sort of geoengineering solutions with green roofs, which I think is all really positive. But I think what this sort of work shows is that we can't forget just managing the land that we have and protecting the land that we have. And so, it's this incredible resource, and just sort of like acknowledging and accounting for the value that it has, I think will allow us to sort of enter those conversations and then be able to sort of weigh greening solutions in a city and make sure that we have a spot at the table when those solutions are presented, and a way to sort of approach that.
Yeah. I think this might get to some of the other things we were talking about, but I may as well just jump in. I think, something I learned in forestry school is that you kind of don't want to tinker with a system that works. Like every time you sort of tinker with one thing, you're not really sure what it's connected to. Mm-hmm. And now we really know what's working in a forest. It's about the soil. It's about the multiple layers and generations of vegetation. And similar to wetlands, we don't really know what new forests and what it's going to take us to get to that place that our current forests are. Right? It's an unknown. It doesn't mean we can't get there. We can't push things on the right trajectory. We certainly do that with some of our major restoration work, but it does really show you the value of what we have and how important it is to protect it, because it's a sure thing.
I think that's a great segue to, I think, talking a little bit more about on the ground work and kind of what this means for natural resource management. So I think let's dig into that a little bit more. How do you adapt natural areas management to maximize carbon?
It's the best thing about this study is that it's basically reinforced all the work we've been doing for the last 35 years, at the Natural Resources Group at Parks. So, to say that this is going to change the way we do things to maximize carbon, the good news is we don't need to do very much. Number one is protect what we have, right? Which is really important. So, you want to keep good forests intact. And the next number 2 is you want to manage for regeneration and resiliency. So when we have healthy forests, or we have not so healthy forests, the goal is to make them more resilient. So we spend years removing invasive plants, and there's a question in the Q&A, we'll get to that, about invasive trees. Before we put in new plants or trees, and certainly during the Million Trees program, we planted a lot of trees, but we also learned that a lot of our forests, even very disturbed forests, still have some resiliency sort of remaining in them. So our management approach is to get us on a trajectory or maintain the trajectory that keeps the multiple layers of the forest, that keeps soils intact, or build soils in a way that we can maintain healthy forests. And that's what we've been doing. We manage for invasive species. We have large capital contracts. We have crews on the ground who really understand the way the systems work. It's not just attacking one thing. It's multiple ways of looking at it. We grow species that are appropriate to the forests that we're managing. We collect seed that's local and appropriate for the sites, not just picking any red maple from anywhere in the country, but actually locally adapted seed that builds in diverse genetic and appropriate genetic sort of material to build in resiliency for the forest. So it's not just about one thing, it's about looking at all the different pieces that really make sure that the forest can keep doing what they've been doing.
I wanted to add, or maybe comment on something that might not be obvious. I think the goal, I think, of management and having healthy forests in cities is not necessarily to have the forest that has the most carbon stored in it. I think having forests with different sizes of trees across the landscape over time, so you have a healthy forest that's regenerating and will continue to support trees and habitat and regeneration over time, I think is sort of critical, because I think that will get us to a landscape that supports the most carbon potential. And I think that having a forest with a lot of really huge trees that are, aging out, but not having trees in the understory or the midstory, I think is sort of critical. So it's, it's like, I think to get there, it requires all of the knowledge that New York City has about creating healthy forests and sort of how to do that with species palettes, trajectories, sequence of restoration events.
It's very convenient that you say that, because we don't have to try to create those situations, right? We have disturbance in the forest all the time, every time, and we know we're going to keep having disturbances with intense storms. So trees fall in the woods, whether you're there or not, of course, and whether they make a sound, we're not sure, right? But we know they fall. And that's the disturbance. And the key is like what you're saying. So that disturbance that's natural and also sometimes not natural because of climate change will create those very diverse conditions, as long as we get in there and make sure it doesn't, get taken over.
That's right. And I just wanted to piggyback on the great points that you both made and just highlight the benefit of partnership between practitioners, including Jennifer and the excellent team that she manages at the Parks Department, and then the nonprofit and academic communities, in terms of weaving together the really unique and site-specific knowledge about place that you can only develop if you spend time really learning and understanding about not just the biophysical landscape that you're managing, but also the people who use it. But then at the same time, the way that partnership can really take that information and kind of leverage it into a new type of resource. And we back in 2018, worked closely with Jennifer and her team to create the Forest Management Framework for New York City, which took financial data and ecological data and allowed us to build a 25-year roadmap that really set a vision for the physical condition of forests, but also gave us really concrete information about what it would cost to get there. And I wanted to mention that because I think in some ways this analysis really builds on that foundation, and it continues to reinforce the value of management. It's sort of one more tool in the toolkit to allow us to keep making the case and to keep making great decisions, especially as you know, climate change continues to kind of press on our city and create new challenges for us as managers.
I think now would be a good time to take one of the questions that came in, since we're talking about management. You know, where do invasive trees stand in this conversation? Are they also as carbon sequestering as native trees? Is the danger only in herbaceous invasives? I think that's a question that came in through the chat.
I can maybe start to answer that, and then maybe Jennifer, you might have something to add about management, or Sarah. But I think all trees store and sequester carbon, and I think invasive species here in New York City can sequester carbon at a very fast rate because they grow very fast. So I think it's more about sort of looking at the forest as a whole and thinking about like, what is the long-term carbon potential of that forest? Like if we had a forest that was, you know, really homogeneous and had, you know, one or two invasive species. So invasive species tend to kind of dominate, and you'll have, you know, maybe a Norway maple forest, which Norway maple can definitely store and sequester carbon, but that would really reduce habitat potential. It would reduce a lot of, you know, the other benefits that we really support. And then if we have a really homogeneous forest, it's also very susceptible to things like the spotted lanternfly, which Jennifer found on her deck right before this call. So if we have invasive pests, like the ash tree is a native tree, but it's, you know, being taken over by EAB or getting killed by the emerald ash borer. So I think we really value native forests because they provide a lot more of the co-benefits, but it's not like invasive trees do not store and sequester carbon.
Right. I think of course, like a tree is a tree in that way. But it's definitely thinking about both, you know, what are we giving up by some short-term gains? And we might be giving up sort of long-term stability and resiliency of the forest. A Norway maple, for those of you who aren't sort of familiar with it, is a perfect example. It's a tree that's not native. And it's not just that it sort of takes over, but what it does is it is the first tree to leaf out in the spring. So when you look out across some landscapes, I can't think of a park offhand, and you'll start to see green first. Those are Norway maples, and they are one of the last to drop their leaves at the end of the season. So what that means is that it gives very little light to the forest floor at critical times when you have spring ephemerals and other plants that need to grow to create this multiple forest. So you see Norway maples, there's nothing growing underneath them. You see them on the sides of like a hillside. It causes erosion because nothing's growing in underneath them. So it has this ripple effect. So yeah, you've got the tree, but you're giving up a lot of not just co-benefits, but actual benefits in the end for forest health and carbon sequestration.
And I know we have other questions, but I want to just mention, and this kind of ties back to the policy and advocacy question, which is that it's, I think, worth clarifying that just on sort of its carbon merits, forest conservation is not the most effective strategy for a place like New York City to reduce its carbon emissions. And so I think it's just worth kind of mentioning and giving the context that this knowledge helps us build a case about the cumulative benefits, or the sort of stacked benefits we sometimes say, of natural areas. The carbon piece and having those numbers really strengthens that case. But as Jennifer and Clara have both alluded to, you know, the recreational benefits, the benefits in terms of biodiversity, the benefits in terms of stormwater retention. Like we think about these systems holistically, but it is very helpful within each of the pieces of that sort of holistic argument to really understand and be able to talk about those benefits. And that is really, from my perspective, kind of where this value kind of really finds a home.
Great. So let's pivot a little bit more and actually let's zoom out and think about this on a national scale. So do you expect a similar pattern if we were to look at other cities?
Yeah, I can start. I think yes, but I think it hasn't really been accounted for. I think in the work Sarah mentioned, a new program that we have at NAC is the Forest and Cities program, which we've been working with 12 cities across the US to focus on the science and management of caring for natural areas within the urban context. And I think we met with them last October here in New York City. And I think what we found was there's a lot of unknowns about natural areas in cities. So like, for example, there's not a common map or like approach for mapping where nature exists in cities. So there's tree canopy, but that doesn't separate natural areas from your street trees or from the trees in your backyard. So I think my hunch is yes, I think we saw the city of Houston has 35,000 acres of natural areas. Seattle has over 5,000 acres of natural areas, but I think one thing that cities don't have that I think this approach could lend itself to being useful is like a way to advocate for those protections. So natural areas, it's not like the wilderness in the West, or they all have their local protection efforts, and some cities are losing natural areas to development at a very rapid rate. So I think we have a paper that's going to come out soon that shows the city of Nashville lost 8,000 acres of natural area in 5 years. The city of Houston lost 20,000 acres of natural areas in 5 years. So there's this really incredible dynamic, I think, about just protection of natural space in cities and sort of what that means when cities are facing housing crises, or, you know, I think having a way to sort of say, beyond just, you know, a few ecologists or a few advocates saying like, this area is important to me, but saying this area is important and it has value, and this is the value it has, and this is how we can describe it. So being able to sort of, I feel like I got on a little bit of a tangent to answer your question, but my hunch is yes, I think there's natural areas that are in cities across the US, but I think having a way to commonly measure them, I think, will be critical to making sure they exist for the future.
I'll give a really quick answer to the question about kind of national scope that also addresses the question about carbon markets, which folks are probably familiar with the idea of a carbon market. It's essentially being able to calculate and then monetize the value of carbon that you store through a variety of different potential activities. There's been a lot of the initial carbon credits that related to trees and forests were afforestation projects, so large scale planting projects in areas that were former agriculture, or maybe even, you know, former forests that had been logged. And then the first urban credits have been focused around tree planting and the ability to put trees in the ground and to ensure that they stay alive and to be able to calculate the carbon that those trees capture. And one of the things that Clara's work allows us to begin to look at in a different way is monetizing the value of managing forests in a way that manages for forest health, but also allows us to capture more carbon through good management practices. So, you know, we know that there's 5 million trees, give or take, in our forested natural areas. The majority of those grew out of seeds, not because they were planted in restoration efforts. And having the mechanism to be able to calculate the value of trees that regenerate naturally, and to be able to understand on that sort of trajectory slide that Clara showed, which shows kind of a moderate condition forest that can either degrade or become healthier through management. Those actions that make your forest healthier are adding carbon value, and the ability to capture and monetize that carbon value can help you pay for those management efforts. So that's something we're definitely interested in exploring further, and having a uniform way of doing those calculations really is kind of the base foundation to be able to have a national market where people from cities across the country and potentially across the world can capture that environmental benefit and turn it into a financial benefit that can then support their work.
Great. So let's start taking questions from the attendees in Zoom. So thanks everybody for the questions you submitted so far. We will wrap up relatively soon. We're going to maybe be a few minutes after 7. So if you do have questions, submit them in the chat now and we'll try to get to them. First, let's start with this question that came in. It says, there are various priorities when referring to ecological restoration, carbon sequestration, biodiversity, public accessibility, etc. How do you balance and prioritize these things and then communicate them to the people that actually manage the parks?
It's a great question. I don't know if this comes from somebody who works for parks, but it's a big agency and it's very distributed. There are 30,000 acres across the whole, all 5 boroughs. We do our best. We do have a Forever Wild program that was created to identify natural areas, the best quality natural areas, in order to protect them. And we have guidelines that are really targeted to each segment of the Parks Department that suggest, for example, don't use salt when you're trying to remove snow when you're on a path in the middle of natural areas, or if you're doing a new capital design around these areas, then you should approach it in this particular way. So we do have these policies. I don't know how great we are at communicating them, but we try to get around to do that. There is actually a law that requires us to use native plants within these Forever Wild areas that was passed by the City Council, and to report on native species. But I agree, it's very difficult. There's a lot of, people love parks, people think about active recreation, and there's a lot of use, and those are absolutely legitimate uses of parks. And it is very tricky for us to do that. But I think there are ways that we continue to educate park managers. Oh, for example, we're doing these, this fall we'll be installing a number of biodiversity pollinator gardens, and specifically focusing on areas that that are really accessible to people. So they're not like you don't have to create a biodiversity garden that's within a natural area, but it's not buried in. It's supposed to be very accessible. And so by doing that, our horticulture, it's both good for the public to see it, but our horticultural staff has to really think hard about it, and we'll be coming up with guidelines for it. And the other last thing I'll mention, because there's some more questions, is that we're doing more to connect our native plant center, right, that grows a lot of native plants, to our other nurseries that grow more for our horticultural groups. So those gardeners are going to learn more about native species, and I think the gardeners are really out there with the public a lot. And I think that'll help sort of incorporate a lot of these priorities into the work we do.
Great. Okay, so let's see. We had another question come in. So it's about weeds. So I volunteer in Morningside Park, where I pull out of weeds. They're hauled off in plastic garbage bags. When you think about safely composting them in a pile, leaf mold free instead, I do not think it will contribute to the weed. Okay, so what do you think about that? I think that's really directed to you, Jennifer.
Yeah, although Clara, you might know some things and you could help me about this one. But my sense is there are a few things. I think I agree that it's better to be recycling organic matter instead of putting it into the garbage in general. But again, If it's going to, you know, contribute towards more invasion of invasive species that could otherwise, we're otherwise controlling, it's not a good idea. I do think that there probably, and I'm not the expert on this, it would probably depend upon the time of year that you're doing this. So if there aren't any, if you're pulling things when there aren't any seeds or berries or anything on that, it's probably not as bad to put it into a compost bin as if you were doing it and the seeds are there. And the second thing that I know, it must also depend upon the heat that's in the compost. So a lot of the sort of, you know, run-of-the-mill garden compost don't really get hot enough to kill the weed seeds. But if you have a more industrial composting system, you probably do get, it probably does get hot enough, and then we don't have to worry about it. So those are a few things I would think about: the time of year and the type of composting you're doing. Anything to add to that, Clara?
I would just add that the species probably matters too. And I see there's a comment in here from someone that says no Japanese knotweed. So like Japanese knotweed could be, you know, more like rhizomatous. So like it could root down somewhere. The garlic mustard, I think, Jennifer, like you said, the season makes a big difference, which, you know, if you pull it at the beginning and it's just the rosettes, then like it doesn't have any seed on it. So I think it's, yeah, I think it kind of depends, but there are some, I think, practices with some like standards and practices for that, for invasive species disposal, that I am not an expert on, but I've seen some of that through like maybe Cornell Cooperative Extension, but there's some like resources out there about that, I think. So yeah, that's about all I have to add.
Great. All right, so I think we'll have our last question. And so it came in and it's asking about wildlife. So it says, how do animals living within these green spaces affect the choices made in taking care of parks and other green spaces?
I have one sort of thought is, I think deer are a wild type of wildlife that can really negatively affect the amount of carbon potential in our forest. I think if you have a deer population that's too high, they'll eat everything in your forest. And so thinking about how to manage wildlife, but I think wildlife is pretty hard to manage too in the city. And I know New York City Parks is working on a deer management plan, or has a deer management plan. So I think that's all I'll add. Maybe yeah, go ahead, Jennifer.
Just one other thought, I know we're already over, is that when we do major restoration projects within, you know, forested areas and natural areas, we do take surveys beforehand or look at surveys we've done in the past and try to sequence and time any disturbance that we have to minimize disturbance to the wildlife. So for example, we did a pretty major restoration in Bucks Hollow in Staten Island, and we did pre-restoration monitoring of the salamander population in the seeps there, and saw where they were, and very carefully sequenced things and watched to see how they were, to make sure we weren't impacting them in that. We do the same with breeding bird seasons. We work around that. We did a study in Van Cortlandt Park that showed that salamander length, which is an indication of their health, actually increased after restoration. So there's like sort of maybe a very short-term dip, but afterwards it goes up. So we're definitely thinking about it in our restoration work, and believe and have seen that it in the end has a net positive result.
Unmute myself. Okay, well, thank you guys so much. I think this was such a great conversation. We really covered a lot in an hour. Thank you, Clara, for your presentation, and then for a wonderful discussion with Sarah and Jennifer. Thank you to our NEC supporters, for everybody tuning in. We have a few board members that joined us, so thank you so much. And then I'll give a final thank you to Con Ed again. Because of their support, we're able to do these events even during COVID and as we switch to virtual format. So we really appreciate their support as well. So thank you again, everybody, and have a wonderful night.
Thanks.